A decisive battle is currently being fought on a flat salt marsh coastal strip known as the Kinburn Spit and Peninsula, which is located south of Mykolaiv and east of Kherson in Ukraine. Several days ago, Ukrainian commando teams began crossing the Dniprovska Gulf from the area of Okaykiv to the Kinburn Spit approximately 2 miles south. From there, the commando units began to fan out, moving east into the Kinburn Peninsula, taking the small fishing villages of Pokrovsky and Vasilivka. Over the following days, the commandos have been steadily reinforced as more units land on the peninsula and move farther east, pushing any remnants of Russian forces. What makes this finger-like peninsula strategic to the Ukraine counteroffensive is that it protects the flank of Kherson while at the same time pushing Russian forces away from this area, which would protect Ukraine from Russia staging their own rocket, artillery, and drone attacks on Odessa and Mykolaiv. Thus, the peninsula serves as a defensive position as well as a staging area for further attacks against Russian forces in and around the Kherson areas. The Kinburn Spit is the tip of a larger peninsula that is over 25 miles long and 4 to 5 miles at its widest. It is mostly flat with just 3 feet in elevation, with several small towns and a combination of sandbars, wetlands, and farms dotting the terrain. This is not the first time that the Kinburn Peninsula has been a strategic location and invaded to be used as a base for artillery fire. On November 10, 1855, British artillery units were landed on the Kinburn Peninsula as part of the Crimean War against Russia, in which the combined forces of the Ottoman Empire, France, Sardinia, Austria, and the United Kingdom defeated the Russian army. While this area has had little attention thus far in the war in Ukraine, its location now makes it an ideal staging area for further attacks against the Russian forces. Control of this area is therefore vital for the short and long-term defense of Kherson from any further Russian attacks, while it creates a flanking movement that will force the Russian forces across the river at Kherson to retreat further to the east or risk complete encirclement. Ukrainian artillery placed in the Kinburn Peninsula could harass Russian forces east of the city of Kherson, as well as stop supplies and reinforcements coming up from the Crimea. It appears that Ukrainian special forces have already landed sizable units in the Kinburn Spit and have begun to push east, clearing the area of all Russian resistance. While Russian forces from the Kherson area were redeployed to the areas to the east, particularly the Bakhmut area, this leaves the Kherson region vulnerable, and with a flanking move by the Ukrainian army around Kherson, the Russian forces will be forced to retreat. The Ukrainian commanders now have good options to cross the Dnipro River south and north of Kherson in similar commando-style landings that will outmaneuver the Russian defenders on the east bank of the river. In the last few days, there has been renewed fighting in and around Kherson, with Russian forces possibly relocating to better defensive positions farther south towards the Crimea Peninsula area itself. These retreats and forced relocations by the Russian forces now places the Crimea within reach of the Ukrainian army, with the city of Armyansk at its most vulnerable point. Depending on how the next few days and weeks develop, the Ukrainian ground forces could be pushing into the Crimea before the end of the year, making a huge gain in territory and morale. This war has been as much a ground fight as it has been a supply and logistics challenge for both the Russian army and the Ukrainian ground forces. But the Russian supply lines have been stretched thin and proven to be prone to attacks by Ukrainian drones, artillery strikes, special forces teams, and partisan actions behind the front lines. The Russian supply lines run through the road networks at Melitopol, past Mariupol that saw much action earlier in the summer, and into the Russian city of Rostov. Reduced supplies are entering the Crimea due to the badly damaged bridge at Kerch. This makes the entire Kherson area vulnerable to the Russian forces, who cannot depend on supplies or reinforcements. If the Ukrainian army can capture or seriously harass the Russian supply lines at Melitopol or even at the port city of Mariupol, the Russian forces in the west will be forced to retreat or surrender. With the onset of cold weather conditions, the Ukrainians can take further advantage by blocking key areas, such as bridges, causing supply vehicles to get stuck for miles on the roads, much like we saw in the first few weeks of the war. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian supply lines from Odessa and Mykolaiv are much shorter, making the possibility of a big push by the Ukrainian ground forces into the north areas of the Crimea a possibility for the first time in the war. If the Ukrainians can pull that off and attack past Armyansk into the Crimea itself, it could tip the scales of the war in Ukraine's favor for possible peace talks. It is for these reasons that the seemingly insignificant stretch of land known as the Kinburn Spit and Peninsula is becoming the next vital battleground in the Ukrainian war. And it looks like the Ukrainians have been pushing and advancing along this narrow peninsula rapidly. While it is still too early to tell what the Russians will do, it is becoming clear that Ukraine has been upping its tactical advantage with lightning attacks, commando raids, and disruption of Russian supply lines. The only major response from the Russian forces has been a stalled advance in the Bakhmut town area in the Donetsk region. What do you think? Leave a comment below, and as always, thank you for watching.